Today's webinar is an interesting topic and one that I don't get to present on very often, but a very, very important concept. Today we're going to talk about maintaining sterility after sterilization. This webinar is kindly brought to you by SafMed, and SafMed has been your solutions partner for over 30 years in both the CFSD and the operating room environment. As I said, our topic is maintaining sterility after sterilization, a very important concept. We are going to focus on some local and international guidelines that cover sterility and maintaining sterility. We're going to look at design and flow in the sterile storage area. Does it matter? Is it important? How should we be designing our CFSD storage areas? We're going to look at the engineering requirements in those areas. And what about the standard operating procedures about maintaining sterility, about sterile storage? Does it matter? Let's have a look at all of these factors in great depth and detail. I'd like to begin by reminding us of a very important concept, and I often refer to this in our webinars, and I'm going to repeat it because I believe it is so very, very important. In the World Health Organization guidelines for the prevention of surgical site infections, there is a statement that touches my heart. It really does, and it says quite clearly, it is the duty of the sterile services manager or the person in charge of the sterile services department to ensure that a medical device does not leave the unit unless it is completely safe to use on a human. That is our responsibility. That is something we owe our patients, and a very important concept. We all know, because this is what we do for a living, that a reusable surgical instrument or device has to undergo a number of reprocessing steps in order to render it safe to use on a patient. So we all begin, you know it quite well, with cleaning, with disinfection, with inspecting, with packaging, with sterilization. But what happens next? How do we actually maintain that sterility after sterilization? Does it matter? Yes, it does. How do we need to safely transport? How do we need to safely handle and store all of our packs and devices and our sets in such a way that we maintain that sterility? Let's go into that in a bit more detail. Do the conditions in the storeroom matter? Should we store our packs on wooden shelves? Should we transport our sterilized sets and packs in open trolleys or in supermarket trolleys? Does it matter if we compress our sets? Does it matter if we compress our packs? Does the condition of the shelving even matter? You may ask yourself that question. And the answer truly is yes. How do I know that? Because I read the guidelines. I'm often asked to comment on a multitude of clinical aspects around CFSD. And when somebody asks me a question about sterile storage, the first thing I do is I go to all of the guidelines and I look at both the local and the international guidelines. So let's start with the international guidelines. If I begin with the World Health Organization Decontamination and Reprocessing of Medical Devices for Healthcare Facilities guidelines, in that document, I know that I'm going to get a set of guidelines that are very easy to read, that are very user-friendly, and that are applicable. And they're applicable to international standards, they're applicable to South African local settings, and they take into account all sorts of levels of facilities. They take into account smaller facilities. They take into account facilities that have access to resources or funding, and they take into account facilities that don't have access to resources and funding, which is why it's really a nice document to look at. If I want to look at a more international and European approach, I'll go to the World Federation for Hospital Sterile Supply guidelines. And those are easy to access. If you click WFHSS and you Google, you will find access to them. They're available, readily available. The trick with those guidelines is, firstly, the English is not 100%. You can't download a whole PDF document, so you need to scroll through each section of the guidelines to try better understand it. And they are not as detailed as some of the other guidelines that we have. So although I go and check them, and of course I want to make sure that I'm complying both with the local and international types of guidelines, WFHSS, well, you need to read it and understand the English and some of the terminology used internationally. Another really nice standard to read is the American ST79 standard. Now that's one that's not available. You have to purchase it at great expense, I'll have you know, but also nicely written, easy to understand information. Of course, though, South Africa as a country adheres to and takes part in the ISO community and the ISO standards. So although the American standard is important to know and nice to have, it's not our first go-to standard. Our first go-to standards are more towards ISO and World Health Organization. But it is one that I like to look at because it is applicable to a degree, and it is very nicely written, easy to understand standard. What about when it comes to local guidelines? Well, I must tell you, we've got some really, really good guidelines and really important documents. The first, of course, is the APSA CFSA, sponsored by SafMed guideline, a guide to decontamination, disinfection, and sterilization practices. So that's a manual, and the manual's recently been updated. The SOPs have recently been updated. It's really an easy-to-read, friendly guide that is readily available, and if you need a copy, let us know. I'm sure we can help you facilitate getting copies thereof. Even more important in the South African setting is actually what the Department of Health has to say. So in 2014, these, we often refer to them as the RUSS guidelines because that was the facility that helped fund the project. And the project was actually completed in conjunction with the CSIR, if you say that nicely, the Council for Scientific and Industrial Research, and that was the architectural department played a very big role in that. And in fact, Denise Sheard, who was instrumental in the initial CFSA guidelines, took part in the writing of these standards and played a really big role in the writing of these standards. So we know that firstly, we have had good input from a CSSD community, from a nursing community into these Department of Health guidelines, as well as good engineering input and good quality staff from CSIR that have had excellent role to play in these particular guidelines that were written. The notification of the publication of these health infrastructure norms and standards, that was published in 2014 by the Department of Health. So not always easy to find these, but there is a website associated with the CSIR that one can go to actually find them. Again, it's not in a single downloadable PDF format at all, but there are sections that you can scroll through on the internet that you can go and look at to look at some of these guidelines. So very important if you're doing a new build, or if you're revamping your CSSD, or if you're trying to understand how your CSSD is supposed to be designed and laid out, an important document to consult. So one that we use often. We have the privilege often of consulting with architects when they're doing a new build or a revamp, and that's of course the go-to document that we will use in the South African setting. So those are our published guidelines. So a lot of the slides I'm going to refer to are indeed from this Department of Health published guideline. That's the one we want to refer to, and that's very important. You all know, and you've known it for a long time already, that the CSSD, of course, divided into several zones. We also know that the flow of work must go from dirty to clean to sterile, and that we don't want to cross over from one bit to the other, that the flow should be in one line. And we also know that the CSSD area, as we said, is divided into the various zones. Of course, today, the zone that we are going to focus on is the sterilization area, the cooling area, and the sterile store, sterile pack, and then on to the dispatch area. If you look at all of the arrows, they demarcate the flow and the correct flow. In this document, there are a number of examples of designs or ideal designs for CSSD, taking into account smaller institutions and medium and large institutions. And if you look at the document, it also in greater detail, although that's not a section I'm going to cover today, will give you a guideline on what size the various areas should be. So in relative terms, how big should the dirty zone be? How big should the inspection and packaging zone be? How big should the sterilization zone be, etc., etc. So it does go ahead and describe that for us, so we begin to understand how our CSSDs are meant to be designed. Now, sometimes we don't have that privilege, and sometimes we don't. We're not in the middle of a new build, but it doesn't mean we can't still work on getting our principles correct and to correct as we possibly can. We can use logic. We can apply the basic principles to make sure that the flow is correct, and we can do what we can under our given circumstances to make sure that we're doing everything that we should do. And if we use a bit of logic, we can still work through it, even if we don't have the perfect design. These gazetted documents go ahead to describe the fact that when you're designing your CSSD, and of course other facilities, but specifically focusing on CSSD, of course, you need to take into effect a number of things, not just flow. You need to take into account infection control. You need to take into account occupational health and safety measures. You need to think about ergonomics, and you actually have to take into account user comfort. Who knew that they actually do take that into account? But funny enough, they do, and very important aspects. Touching on some of the points that they raise, under infection control, some of the things that popped out for me were restricted controlled access. Restricted controlled access, in fact, applies to CSSD itself and, of course, the sterile storage zone and area. There's a lot of focus on the fixtures, the fittings and the materials and the finishes that we should be using in the design of these areas, because all of those fixtures, fittings and finishes must allow for easy cleaning and, importantly, a prevention of buildup of harmful microorganisms. I sometimes wonder if we really think about that when we're designing certain things. Sometimes we put strange little tiled areas behind basins in our CSSDs, or hand washing basins in certain areas of the CSSDs. And we don't take into account that those finishes will often chip and break, and that's an issue for keeping things clean or buildup of harmful organisms. Sometimes people go ahead and use a lot of wood or laminates or the shrink-wrapped cupboards because they're cheap. No, I didn't say that. Because they're cost-effective. And of course, that's not necessarily the right materials to be used in our areas. I've heard of people asking if they could in fact use what is the word, slate, and the other term for it, granite in the CSSD area because it looks lovely granite. You can't. Granite absorbs, so it's really not an ideal surface for our from an infection control perspective in our CSSDs. Occupational health and safety. The finishes on the floor need to be non-slip. It's a wet area often in the dirty side of the CSSD. We need suitable and adequate facilities to support and encourage high levels of hand hygiene. What about the ergonomics? If we just think about our heavy sets and our heavy packs, that of course we overload in the South African setting like you cannot believe, but those we have to lift them, we have to carry them, we have to transport them, we have to put them on the shelves in our CSSD. What about the ergonomics involved in that? And user comfort. User comfort, of course, matters about the height of the table that you're going to work on, the lighting that you need, the amount of noise that you're going to be exposed to in all of our areas. So when designing the CSSD, don't forget we need to take into account infection control, occupational health and safety, ergonomics, and user comfort, all important factors. Moving on to various parts of the Health Facilities Guide for CSSD, and as we said, focusing now on sterile storage. The sterile storage area should be located next to the sterilization area. It should be a dedicated storage and dispatched area. It should be separate. It should be controlled. It should be enclosed, and there should be limited access to the area. And the only function of that sterile storage area is that of storing sterile supplies. If you have a look at the picture on the right, and I have numerous pictures that we're going to go through today, and of course when it came to putting this PowerPoint presentation together, I had so many options to choose from on incorrectly designed or incorrect areas or incorrect ways of sterile storage. Here, of course, is a sterile storage area where a whole multitude of things were being stored. Non-sterile stuff like boxes, which of course should not be in the sterile area at all. As you can see, there's a cylinder. I think that's a cylinder of air by the looks of it. Solid shelving. And this is definitely not a dedicated, separate, controlled area. Of course, it has a multitude of things in it, and it really and truly shouldn't be there. We also need to think about the fact that, okay, it says over here that the sterile store area needs to be next to or close to the sterilization area. And sometimes the design of the facility is not as such, or you might have an old building or a structural wall that can't be moved or can't be changed. And we need then the architects to think laterally, but to think within the basics of correct principles. So what can we do under our given circumstances if our sterile storage area isn't ideal or isn't what it needs to be? So we need to take this into cognizance and look at all of these factors that we're going to cover today, and hopefully we can find a way to work around our circumstances, or even better, design properly. Of course, there's that old and very important concept of hopefully having somebody from the CSST, hopefully somebody from the operating rooms, and hopefully somebody from infection prevention to be involved in the team that makes the decisions around these designs or these rebuilds or refurbishments or renovations that happen in your CSST environment. The guidelines talk to the fact that the area should be protected from direct sunlight. In other sections, it talks about natural light, which is really awesome to have in your CSST if you can, if you're not down in the bottom in the dungeon. But if there is natural light, we need to protect our packs from direct sunlight. There needs to be adequate and appropriate stainless steel slatted shelving in a clean environment, and adequate and appropriate mobile storage systems and trolleys. That's what it refers to in the guidelines. So this particular CSST, where the packs are really and truly, these single items are pretty well overloaded to begin with, and secondly, right in front of the window, are absolutely not ideal. The guidelines also have this really nice table in it that talk to the temperature, air exchange, and humidity in the various areas of the CSST in the various zones. As you can see over here, the waste disposal area, the sterilization area, the cooling area, and the sterile store need to be the coolest. So in the South African setting, in these guidelines, they refer to between 16 and 21 degrees. I don't know about you, but the sterilization area and the so-called cooling area, many of us don't have cooling areas, is normally the hottest area in our CSST, or one of the hottest areas in our CSST. Many of our CSSTs don't have air conditioning at all. And of course, the fact that it says over here that the temperature should be between 16 and 21 means that there should actually be some sort of air conditioning or mechanical control of the air in these areas, because that mechanical control will also not only manage the temperature, but often also the humidity. And humidity is very, very important. I remember a few years ago being at Africa Health and having the privilege of chatting to some of our colleagues from other African countries, and somebody in fact was from Rwanda and a little bit closer to the equator, where the humidity was horrendous, and apparently they just have water pouring down the walls, often in the operating rooms and in the CSSTs, because of where they are. We have some areas in our country, in Mpumalanga, where the humidity is also quite high. So very important to take into cognizance the temperature and the humidity in the area. The South African guidelines talk about air exchanges per minute. Many of the other guidelines talk about air exchanges per hour in the CSSD, so I guess it depends on the guidelines that you're reading, but very important that there is some form of mechanical ventilation and control of the air in these areas. that the temperature is appropriately maintained, and that the humidity is appropriately maintained. This, of course, is a concept that's important in theatres for different reasons, partly the same reasons and other reasons, and of course in the CSSD. Now, if we have all of these air conditionings, of course, then there are the vents to these air conditionings, either the inlets or the outlets, and they are very important to us. And of course, if we're doing a lot of linen folding, green, classic, typical cotton linen, there is going to be a huge amount of lint. And these areas, inlets and outlets, need to be regularly cleaned and maintained, and we need to get rid of all of that lint because it is going to be a huge issue for us. Some areas, thankfully, have got separate linen areas or linen folding areas, as many of our CSSDs do still use traditional cotton linen as patient drapes. And if you could do that, all that folding of linen in a separate area, that would be better. Of course, then the lint is out the way and it doesn't affect our air conditioning. What do the World Health Organization guidelines have to say about temperatures and humidities? It says over there that a comfortable ambient temperature is essential for the staff to function effectively and efficiently. And it's also, of course, important to ensure that the heat generated by the processing equipment is dissipated to prevent an increase in the temperature. The following temperatures have been recommended in temperate climates, and cooler storage is required in hot countries where the ambient temperatures are even higher. Here, the World Health Organization says the sterile storage area should be between 15 and 25 degrees, and as we saw in the South African guidelines, it's 21 degrees is the max that they suggest, and I guess that is based on the South African setting and what we know to be temperatures common to our country. A point to consider: what is the temperature in your sterile storage area? Do you measure it? Is there some form of mechanical device that you can go to read it? How do you know what the temperature actually is in your sterile storage area, or the humidity is? The relative humidity is recommended to be at 40 to 50%, but in hot and humid countries, it may even rise up to 70%. And which the World Health Organization clearly states, this can adversely affect the sterile barrier system. In the absence of controlled ventilation, working conditions become unbearable, affecting also the integrity of the sterile barrier system. So therefore, it is important that humidity in the CSSD must be mechanically controlled. I hope that everybody has mechanical controls in the CSSDs. I've been to many CSSDs where this is not the case. I've been to many CSSDs where, in fact, they used to have air conditioning, but it's broken, not functioning, and nobody's maintained it. So it is incredibly hot in some of those CSSDs, as you can imagine. And often the sterile storage area is not actually separated from the sterilization area itself. And as you can imagine, the heat from the autoclaves, from steam sterilizers, can really and truly ingress into other areas of the CSSD. This is an article from the AORN Journal, Association of Operating Room Nurses Journal, so it's an American publication. It actually is referring to managing and mitigating the risks of temperature and humidity events in the perioperative setting, which of course is important, but it also is really applicable to us in the CSSD. Just reading the abstract: temperature or relative humidity variations that fall outside of the recommended parameters for the perioperative environment and CSSD can have serious implications for patient safety and as well as business continuity. Some pathogenic microorganisms can thrive in prolonged elevated humidity. Supplies and equipment in the perioperative environment exposed to variations in temperature and humidity may become sources of infection or undergo alterations in functions, putting patients at increased risk for harm. Other negative effects include increased costs, of course, and legal liability associated with this, and of course, potential decreased patient satisfaction or delays or rescheduling issues. Temperature and humidity, an important concept in the sterile storage area and in the operating rooms as a whole. Now, what about lighting? Another important concept, very, very important to us in the CSSD. In our guidelines over here, clearly states that light fittings are potentially a major source of dust and dead insect buildup. One would hope there are no insects in our CSSDs or in our sterile store area at all, but we do know things happen. We do know doors need to open and close, and we know that flies and all sorts of things can get into our CSSDs and into our theatre complexes. And these are things that we need to manage. Hospital management should have a regular maintenance process in place to maintain a clean environment. The facilities guidelines specify the recommended level of lighting in the various zones in the CSSD. And as you can see, which is quite logical, the level of light required in the instrument inspection area, so it's normally our packing room, is much higher than that is required in the storage area. Although it's quite important to have good light in the storage area so that we can see our packs and know what it is we're trying to collect. And if you're like me and your eyes are no longer what they used to be, I also need glasses, not only light, to be able to see what's going on. And that's why I can't read the menu at the restaurant anymore, because we need adequate light. Light is often referred to as in lumens or in lux. And as you can see over here, the general inspection area, they specify the minimum, the average, and the maximum for all of these areas. Detailed inspection, where we really are looking at our sets, the average is 1,500 lux. Maximum of 2,000 lux. So maximum is also important because you don't want too much light, you don't want too much glare, which can also be a strain on your eyes. So although letting in natural light would be lovely, and wherever possible it is requested and advised to allow in a bit of natural light, but we need to worry about glare. Wash areas, you can see the lumens there, average is 750, minimum of 500. And in our storage areas, the minimum is 200 lux of light, average of 300, and a maximum of 500 lux of light. So I'm very sure that when you're purchasing your light bulbs, you are able to see on the light bulbs what the lux is for that particular light that you are about to install. So hopefully we can take into account the electricity requirements and where we can save, but we still need the lux. Still need to be able to sleep clearly. I asked the question earlier, does the shelving matter? Absolutely. In the section Fixtures, Fittings and Equipment in the guidelines, there is a very specific section on sterile storage shelving. Okay. So remember this, huh? Remember there's a test. Okay. Packs should be stored away from the direct sunlight, we've spoken about already. Not next to or under any sinks where they could get wet or could get damaged. Packs should be 25 centimeters from the floor, 5 centimeters from the wall, and 45 centimeters from the ceiling height. And this is all to allow for the circulation of air, a very important concept. If you have a fire safety sprinkler system in the pack room or wherever within your CSSD department, be careful about placing packs directly under sprinkler heads, as that could cause a leak. As per the guidelines, it also makes good sense to use adjustable shelves or shelving. Freestanding or mobile shelving can also be used. Open slotted shelving is more commonly used. Open slotted shelving allows for the dust to pass through, making it a lot easier to clean than solid shelving that will gather dust. So how do we actually dust these areas? Another important point. So if we've got slotted shelving, how are we going to dust them? Do you dust them? How often do you dust them? Who does that dusting? Very important concept. Shelving. Does the shelving matter? Yes. Should it be a wooden box? No. Should it be made of wood? Not at all. It needs to be made of fixtures and materials that are easy to clean. Slotted, easy to clean shelving. Going to a bit more detail from the APSA manual, the APSA CFSA manual, should I say. Let's have a look at this. When creating a storage system, you can adapt shelving to the specific needs of your own facility. That's why it's quite nice if it's shelving that you can design in such a way that you can adjust the height of the shelving. If you've got really big gaps between the shelving, you're going to end up stacking tons of stuff on top of each other, whereas if you put narrow gaps in it, it limits the amount of sets you can put on top of each other. The type of shelving used should help protect the sterile goods. It should allow for easy stock rotation, and it should be easy to clean. As long as your system conforms to the hygiene and security requirements, you can design it around that, around your needs to suit your circumstances, as long as you're within the basic outlines and the correct parameters. These requirements include infection control and restricted access to unauthorized or to only authorized personnel. Freestanding or mobile shelves can be a practical solution, depending on your circumstances, and it can often allow staff to access from all sides of the storage area and hopefully help facilitate rotation of your products. You need enough space to store all the medical devices in your department that you are using. You need enough space that you don't need to bend or fold large packs. You need to be able to store components in such a way that you can see what you have in the storeroom. It doesn't help if you shove a whole bunch of stuff in a very small shelf or in a drawer system that you can't see what you have. Very important to be able to see them. You need to store products in a way that allows you to handle them easily, and your storage system must allow that you can apply the first in, first out stock rotation system. Very important. Looking at some aspects from the World Federation for Health of Hospital Sterile Suppliers, you say that a few times quickly, going to their guidelines, 3 things popped out over there for me. Number 1, you should have written standard operating procedures about your sterile storage principles and management systems. There should be training of all the operators. Everybody who works with sterile packs needs to be trained on how to manage those sterile packs. It doesn't help if somebody goes into damp dust, makes a slotted shelf wet, and then puts a sterile pack on top of a wet shelf. Very important everybody is trained. You have to take into account occupational health and safety measures for handling of heavy items. And of course, that you have standard operating procedures that define everything around your sterile storage, including how you clean it. So in our APSA guide, standard number SOP number 17 deals with sterile storage. I haven't gone through all of the aspects of this particular SOP. I've just focused on a few important points. There should be a procedure in the sterile area for daily cleaning. So daily cleaning should include inspecting the storeroom area daily, shelves to be damp dusted, check the labels on the shelves, make sure they're legible, and if they've fallen off, please replace them. And of course, there should be labels to begin with. Mopping the floor, removing all items that are not supposed to be in the storeroom out of the storeroom, wearing correct clothing, protective clothing when cleaning, and checking sterile stores for expiry dates. Weekly cleaning, walls and windows, if there are any, windows that is, damp dust as required. Shelves must be unpacked and damp dusted properly once a week. Unpack containers that contain single packed items, because a lot of those containers often have hordes of green dust in them. Don't forget to wipe out those containers, but also to let them dry before you put the items back inside of the containers. Here's a section on rotation of sterile stock from the same APSA CFSA guidelines. Check the integrity of your sterile packs. Is it whole? Is it damp? Is it wet? Is it torn? Rotate your stocks daily, or as you're bringing in the new stock, make sure that the older stock comes to the front. Prevent prolonged storage periods by adjusting the number of sterile packs according to your needs, so don't over-cater for your needs. Regulate the stock supply for the day, especially of the day-to-day items that you need the most and you need often. Reprocess and re-sterilize packages as they become contaminated. Check the sterile integrity of each pack on receipt and on a daily basis. So these items should not get into the sterile store if they were torn to begin with. You need to be checking them, of course. You're checking for the date of sterilization and assuming you're using an expiry date. the contents, the signature of the packer, the autoclave number, that the details are on the set as they are supposed to be, that there has been a color change of the chemical indicator or tape on the outside, that the masking tape is still firmly applied, that the pack is dry, that it's whole and that it's clean and it's not torn. And remember that packs should only be issued to customers, i.e. the operating room, if all the checks have been carried out. A very important concept. Back to the WFHSS guidelines, and it reiterates what we've already said. Housekeeping should be regularly performed. They use the word and registered. I guess that means recorded. Shelving carts and bins used for sterile storage must be maintained, organized, clean, and dry. Very important. For safety and ease of handling, heavy instrument trays should be stored on the middle shelves. It does not make sense to store your heaviest items high up or low down. Now, I know we want to group our items, so we may be grouping laparotomy sets together, or we're grouping neuro sets together. Yes, very important to group items in a manner that you can understand where they all are. Some people group alphabetically. It really and truly depends on your circumstances. But however you are grouping, please bear in mind that the heavier items should be around middle shelf height, because that's easier from an ergonomics point of view to handle those heavy sets. Of course, a reminder that storage should be organized in a first in, first out principle to allow for rotation of reusable medical devices. Going through an article, this is in Infection Control Today. I'm not sure if it's anything you guys get access to or read every now and again. Infection Control Today is a magazine. It's not a journal, but some really good quality information is published in Infection Control Today and written by some people of good integrity that we know. So remember these concepts. In this, maintaining proper sterile storage conditions, some aspects to remind ourselves. Sterility maintenance is directly affected by packaging materials, storage methods and conditions, handling practices and methods of distribution. Just to focus on that packaging material, sterility maintenance is directly affected by packaging materials. That is very true, and in the next webinar we will cover that section as well, how the number of layers that you choose to use for your packaging and the type of packaging material you use, what effect that has potentially on your shelf life of your packs. So, sterility maintenance affected by packaging materials, storage methods and conditions, handling practices, and methods of distribution. I'm quoting directly from this article. It is essential to ensure that all sterile products, whether sterilized in the facility or purchased from an outside manufacturer, be maintained and stored in such a way that sterility is maintained until the product is used. So remember, that includes the operating room. Physical damage to the package, such as holes and tears, can be caused by excessive or improper handling, compression of packages on storage shelves, when everything is packed too tightly or squeezed into a small area, when we're stacking packages and instrument sets, and crushing packages when personnel are carrying them in their arms, which of course we should never do. Always carry a sterile set or a sterile pack, preferably on a trolley and not close to your body if you really have to carry it by hand. So if you look at the image on the right, again, one of my numerous examples of poor practices, or should I say incorrect practices. The trick with sterile storage is that sometimes we start to lose control of it, or CSSD loses control of it because now it becomes in the hands of the operating room. So what happens between CSSD and theatre also matters. This scrub sister is hopefully very well prepared for her case, because she has absolutely everything she could possibly need, but it really and truly isn't packed in a very nice manner. This will not help maintain sterility. Right, continuing with our article with direct quotes, tears and holes allow airborne bacteria and dust to penetrate the package, compromising the sterility of the device within. Packages should not be stored in a manner that they will crush, bend, puncture, or compress them Storage bins, carts, and shelves should not be overloaded. And if you look at the examples of the pictures that I have over there, those are all very sad circumstances. Now, that particular pack, the one on the top, I found that outside the operating room about to be used on a patient. The one at the bottom, I've long since forgotten where I took that photograph, but as you can see, it's some plastic containers that some sterile stock came in that somebody's not tried to use. It's really flimsy, it's really clumsy, and there's so much stuff that's been shoved in there that's really and truly not ideal storage conditions. Touching a little bit on handling over here, personnel can avoid potential condensation issues by not placing warm packaging on cool surfaces. Moisture will allow microorganisms from the air and surfaces to wick through the packaging materials. Soil can also compromise sterility. Any packaging that is visibly soiled or stained must be considered contaminated, and its contents should be either reprocessed or discarded. So that is, as you can see in the picture on the right, an image of some form of staining that item came out of the autoclave like that. I do not know what that is. I have no idea. Something relating to the steam, quality of the steam maybe, contaminants in the steam. So if that's on the packaging, what's inside or what's on the devices themselves? Soil from dirty transport carts, soiled hands, and unclean storage bins or shelves can compromise sterility. So, starting to summarize, what have we learned today? We've covered quite a bit of information. Some of it you know, some of it you remember, and some of it you've been reminded about. It's important to note that the Department of Health has published the Healthcare Facilities Guidelines, and that we're storing our packs, we should be storing our packs in a manner that are in line with what the Department of Health says for our country. The design, flow, temperature, and humidity in the sterile storeroom matters. The type of shelving we use and how we load that shelving is important. We should have very clear standard operating procedures that incorporate aspects like stock rotation and handling of our sterile packs and sets to make sure that we can maintain the sterility of our packs until such time as they are used. Now, next week, we will look at shelf life and, of course, expiry dates and event-related sterility. We'll look a little bit on the design of the dispatch area, what the guidelines say about that, and then we'll focus a little more on transport and handling, including handling of packs in the CSSD all the way to the operating room. Thank you very much for attending today's session. As normal, in a little while's time, I will send you the link to the post-webinar test. All of our webinars are available on our YouTube channel. If you want, please go and have a look for it. Search for SafMed YouTube channel or drop me an email. I'll send you the links. I'll send you the links to the previous webinars as well as the previous post-webinar tests so that you can complete the test. If you complete the test, of course, we will give you a certificate of attendance. No completion of test, no certificate of attendance. Thank you very much for joining us today. I hope you enjoyed your session and see you again next Wednesday at 11 o'clock. Thank you so much.